Whoa. Can't seem to escape this podium. But I'm here for a really good reason this time. This is our 40th year anniversary, but there's no way that you can talk about the 40 years of glorious history of this party without talking about its founder and leader, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. People often look at our party and see, they see what happened in the 1960s and subsequently, they see the imprisonment and assassination of our leaders, the destruction of our organizations, and they ask, how is this party still here? How did this party survive that assault? And the reality is, the reason why this party is still here is because of our leadership, because of the incredible leadership and theory that has been provided to us by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. It's not that we did not suffer some of that attack. In fact, looking at our chairman's history, that goes beyond just the 40 years of the African People's Socialist Party, who was an organizer for SNCC in the 1960s, building the first membership-based organization of SNCC right here in this city of St. Petersburg, and who, as a result of having ripped down this terrible anti-African mural that was hanging in the city hall of this city, suffered having been in prison off and on in the 1960s for several years. And our party suffered more than that, even subsequent to the founding of the African People's Socialist Party in 1972. One of our co-founders, Lawrence Mann, was assassinated. And you see a whole wall full of comrades who have fallen in this struggle. So it's not that our movement has not been the subject of attack. It's not that our movement has not been scathed by this attack, but this movement was able to not only survive but to thrive, coming out of the defeat of the Black Power movement of the 1960s, and it is because of our Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And not everybody was able to survive that assault on the Black Power movement. And one of the main reasons why a lot of people weren't able to survive it, not just living, but sometimes surviving it, mentally, was not having the type of ideological foundation that we have in what the chairman has established, African internationalism, also known as Yeshitelism. The chairman, with this theory, and not just theory, but practice, solved many of the theoretical issues that existed inside of the Black Power movement in the 1960s, at a time when there was not there was a general lack of consistent science inside of the Black Power movement. Our chairman brought science to the Black Power movement. When the counterinsurgency was impacting on the Black Power movement, our chairman defined it when many people didn't even know what was happening, just knew that we were under attack. Our chairman defined what was the counterinsurgency, defined this war that the U.S. government was waging on African people and on its leadership. Our chairman defined that. Our chairman also took us beyond, through African internationalism, took us beyond just this definition of the struggle that we're engaged in as one against racism, as so many people had defined it, in the 1960s, and so many people still define it as today. Our chairman helped us to understand, in this process of bringing science to the Black Power movement, he defined this struggle of ours as one against colonialism, and not only define the struggle that African people were engaged in as one against colonialism, this relationship, between that is imposed on us by imperialism, this parasitic relationship. But our chairman also defined that parasitic relationship that is the basis for this whole system, this whole imperialist system. Our chairman helped us to understand that the foundation upon which capitalism even rests is colonialism, is the theft of resources from Africans and other oppressed peoples around the world. Chairman Omali Yeshitela brought us that with African internationalism. And our chairman defined the role of white people in this struggle. In a time, again, where after the defeat of the Black Power movement in the 1960s, we saw white left organizations all through the African community picking the scraps following this defeat. And our chairman defined how that relationship should be. What relationship white people in the white community could have to the African Revolution and must have to the African Revolution for it to have a future. And created the African People's Solidarity Committee, which we see doing incredible work today. All of these questions were questions that were solved by Chairman Omali Yeshitela, answered by Chairman Omali Yeshitela with African internationalism. As I said, African internationalism is beyond just theory, and we'll hear more about that later, but it's beyond just theory. It is manifested practically in the real world, in the building of the African People's Socialist Party and in the building of the African Socialist International, connecting Africans everywhere around the world to the same struggle. It is manifested in the presence of this party that has not just had 40 years of existence, but had 40 years of building. And it is the chairman's theory that brought to us reparations as a household word. People speak about reparations now. You didn't hear that discussion happening in general until our chairman set out in the 1980s to begin to build world tribunals and reparations to African people and define what reparations is, what reparations must be, as opposed to a payout. But as a function itself of the African Revolution that helps to define for African people out there this relationship that exists between us and white power. So the chairman's theory and practice, African internationalism and the African Socialist International, is what has taken our struggles in St. Petersburg, in Philadelphia, in South Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Belgium, in England, in Bahamas, in Colombia, out of isolation, and tied this struggle that we're engaged in everywhere around the world together as one struggle, recognizing that we are one Africa, one nation. Yes. That's what Chairman Omali Yeshitela has brought to us. And he took the work of Garvey and built upon it the African Socialist International. And so the chairman made clear these things for us. And we have to raise up our chairman. Now, our chairman stands in the company of giants like Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Malcolm X, and others. In fact, he not only stands in the company of these giants, but he stands on the shoulder of these giants and has brought to us African internationalism, the theory and practice of the future. So I want to call on you to stand today as we bring forth our chairman, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru! Uhuru!
Uhuru! Uhuru! I want to express my appreciation to Comrade Nyabinga for the introduction and to the National Central Committee of the African People's Socialist Party. And of course, we extend recognition, leadership of this party, beyond the borders of this country, and have to include Comrade Louise Kinshasa in the definition of this leadership. I would like, first of all, just to repeat the recognition that was just given briefly and slightly to comrades Couture Carey and Lawrence Mann, who are on that wall, who were co-founders of our party. Comrade Lawrence Mann was the leader of an organization down in South Florida called the Black Rights Fighters in the 1960s that dealt primarily with migrant workers. Many people don't know that at least at the time, and it may still be true, the primary economic sector of the state of Florida was agriculture. And there was an incredible migrant stream. At that time, I think primarily Africans, people who were brought in from Haiti, Jamaica, the islands and what have you, worked, especially down south, places like Belgrade, Florida, growing and harvesting sugarcane for this incredibly powerful sugar industry that owned literally thousands and thousands of acres of land down in Florida, and kept, along with other aspects of the agriculture industry, Africans late into the 1960s living behind barbed wire fences without any kind of freedom at all. And Comrade Lawrence Mann was an organizer of the migrants who were in that area. Increasingly, that migrant stream is becoming what people characterize as Latino. You know, there are more Mexicans and Guatemalans and other people who were in that migrant stream. But at the time, it was primarily African, and Lawrence Mann was a magnificent leader. He had also been like the vice president of the NAACP down in Fort Myers, Florida. And he had an incredible voice. He could sing. He was really a great singer. And Comrade Couture Carey lived in Gainesville, Florida. She was a teacher, and she led an organization called the Gainesville Black Study Group. And they were primarily students and teachers, mostly students that she was able to influence, students from the universities and also high school students. She was an extraordinarily influential person. She joined with us, the JOMO, that I led, and you've seen pictures of some of the JOMO forces. The brother, the second two pictures on the top, from the top left, are JOMO pictures. Comrades Pookie and Ping, who was an extraordinary field marshal. I mean, that literally in the streets engaged imperialism right here in serious combat. He was an incredible man. But along with JOMO, the Black Rights Fighters and the Gainesville Black Study Group came together as a part of the process in 1972 to build African Liberation Day, which was the first African Liberation Day that occurred in this country. It may have been something like May 26, sometime around that time frame. And I say the first in this country, but it was the first African Liberation Day that had been resolved at the Organization of African Unity founding in 1963. And a comrade who had visited with Frelimo came back in the 70s. Frelimo was the African liberation, the front of our struggle that was happening in Mozambique, and engaged the Portuguese in armed struggle, and he came back. And all of this, of course, is really after the military defeat, or around the same time, or the culmination of the military defeat of the Black Revolution in this country. And actually, we had been been hurt seriously in various other parts of the world. And he came back with a message from those comrades that it would be important to try to build the African Liberation Day mobilization and use that in part to raise resources for the resistance movement and against Mozambique, against Portuguese rather, and South African and Rhodesian colonialism. And it was during this process where Jomo was organizing throughout the state of Florida to participate in this. I was a member of the steering committee of that initial African Liberation Day national coordinating committee. And so Comrade Lawrence Mann and Comrade Couture Carey, they played a role in organizing throughout the state to build for that, and that was the process through which we united as the African People's Socialist Party. They were heroic forces, and Comrade Couture was just an incredible woman. She was very talented and very cultured kind of woman. She was a teacher in a place called Archer, Florida, which is right outside of Gainesville. It's mostly like a rural area. And in her classroom, she had the red, black, and green, borders around her bulletin boards and things like that. And every morning, the children in her class would stand up and do the African pledge. It was really extraordinary because one of the white kids did sort of like what our children do now when they give the American flag pledge. He would go outside and stand outside while the students would do the African pledge. They began a campaign against Couture that resulted in her losing her job. And part of the campaign was initiated by a man who was on the city council, who, it turns out, was an expert in counterinsurgency, who actually at the time had a book that he had authored in the library in Gainesville on counterinsurgency. So he led the attack on Couture. And it was an incredible struggle that we were involved in to defend her. But she was a magnificent leader, had a lot of courage. On one occasion, under her leadership, we actually ended up seizing the radio station at the University of Florida, and making revolutionary pronouncements. With a little more help, we might have been able to seize the city. I understand in some instances that's the first stage of announcing new governments. But she was fired, and she was the one who led the work in Gainesville, Florida. That's how we came into contact with ZANU. And there were actually people who were there in the city who were from Zimbabwe, and in fact, one of whom's relatives actually ended up being in the government after that. So I just wanted to acknowledge those comrades, and these comrades on the wall. Sister Anditu out of Baltimore, Maryland. Incredible woman soldier who had been a member of the Black Panther Party before it was defeated, and during a time where there was tremendous demoralization in the country and even in the ranks of what was remaining of the leadership. And there's stories that could be told about how she, by herself, had to defend one of those characters. I won't get into that now because I'll leave you with your images of who those characters were. And Peggy Peterman, who was there, who nobody knew was associated with our movement, or the state didn't. She worked for the St. Petersburg Times. She came to be a quite respected columnist for the St. Petersburg Times. And she used to write these articles. I'll never forget this one story she wrote where she said in the story that in the black community, they don't refer to it as the ghetto. It's referred to as the colony. And of course, the white people didn't know whether we referred to it as a colony or not. So that went into the newspaper. And that was like a real mass way that we were indoctrinating and helping the African masses to understand that we were living under colonialism. She would do those kinds of things from the pages of their newspaper. And she was an incredible force. And truthfully, nobody knew, but she kept our guns, in her attic at the time, and there's, Sonny Leggett, Gilbert Leggett up there, who was a dentist in this city and committed class suicide in a way. He had done it even before we met him because he wanted to be a baseball player. He was a baseball player and he wanted to be a professional baseball player, but his father was also a dentist and demanded that he be a dentist. So he had an office on 22nd Street and 9th Avenue South here in this city, but spent most of his time in the back of the Buddy West's barbershop, where they gambled and drank gin and told various war stories. But he was our first treasurer of JOMO. And the first person that I saw after the police had handcuffed me in the back seat of a police car, must have been in 1968, and had clubbed me, like with a billy club. It really worked me over. And when I was in the emergency room at the hospital, the first person I saw was Sonny Leggett, who came, to check on me and see what, my teeth and what have you. And Ping came too. And Sonny Leggett came to see about my teeth, and Ping came and he saw me on the gurney and face blooded, and it really messed me up. And he saw me and he just spun on his heel. And he started marching out of JOMO had surrounded the hospital. I mean, we were everywhere. We were ubiquitous. I think that's the word that's commonly used. And Ping started marching out of the hospital, and everything that was white between the emergency room and the hospital door exit, I'm afraid, met the wrath of Ping. And it's that night that the burning of this city started in earnest. I mean, JOMO engaged this city in guerrilla warfare that went on for months. I mean, literally for months. So seriously that I learned to tell the sound to distinguish the sound of fire trucks from other emergency vehicles like ambulances and police cars by ear. Because the fire trucks were running with such frequencies. And these were incredible forces. And Comrade Mikhail from Ethiopia, and Pule Shoba from South Africa, occupied Azania down here, who came into our work in Oakland, California. And of course, Desi Woods and all of these other incredible forces. And there's a wealth of stories that could be told about every one of them as a part of our party, your party. And I mentioned them. And of course, Susan Worth from the African People's Solidarity Committee, whose mother had her kidnapped because of her involvement in this movement, who spoke, I think, 5, 6 languages, and was a real soldier, whose mother had her kidnapped. And it was some organization that was actually run by an African man that they would use to do what they call deprogram people who were in cults. And they took this woman and they tortured her over several days and perhaps weeks. They would do things like strip her naked and I mean, did horrible things to her. And eventually, as a consequence of that, she never recovered from that, and eventually she took her life by stepping in front of a train. But these were our forces, and there are many. There are others, who are not up here, but they are part of the Uhuru movement, and you should be aware of it. And one of the reasons that they're there is to remind us all that we are not part of some fly-by-night entity, flash in the pan, so to speak. That we've been here, we've been engaging with imperialism for 40 years, and not just here, but engaged in struggle and transforming this earth on which we live. This is our party. Comrades, brothers and sisters, I hope you'll bear with me. This is going to be probably the most, I hope it's the most beneficial sector of the plenary process that we're involved in. It's going to be, I believe, a trying sector, because for most of this day and part of tomorrow, what we are going to be doing is going through the political report to this plenary. The political report to this plenary is really, in many ways, based off the political report to our Congress, our 5th Congress, that happened in July of last year, of 2010. And I don't normally do presentations in this way, because I feel obligated all the time to hold the interest of the people that I'm talking to, and I work very hard at doing that. And I usually don't work from written presentations, but this is really important. And we want to do this political report differently than we've ever done a political report before. That's why we're spending all day doing the report. Because truth of the matter is that most of the people who are in our movement today, young people who are being introduced for the first time to ideological, theoretical questions, to politics, and even a certain kind of history, not just our own history, not that George Washington Carver, created peanut butter, which is an obscenity, because peanut butter comes from Africa, don't you? That's where George happened to come from. And his grandmama probably showed him how to do that, you understand? And not just silliness like that, but history of struggle, of resistance, not just African resistance, but resistance around the world. Most of us have not been involved in that kind of discussion, don't have that kind of background with which we come into this discussion. So we have these discussions based on some assumption that people have some relationship to this information, to political history, to ideological, theoretical history, to organizational history, and that's not the case. So we want to spend this time in this discussion differently. And so at the risk of boring everybody in here, we're going to read this. I'm going to read this, and I've developed it into 7 different components. And I will read, and then after one session of the 7, we'll discuss it. And this can only work if you participate, because there are all kinds of questions that I know you have. I learn this every time we have a plenary, every time we do a political report to a Congress or something like that, based off the assumption that we leave our Congress, our meeting, with everybody united around these questions, then I keep running into evidence that people have not understood what it was we were talking about. And it's not to suggest that everybody will understand everything after this session, but I'm saying that I believe that if we struggle for it, if we raise the questions, there are questions about history, like Comrade Diop Olabala I heard in a discussion with Comrade Elaine Brown, who was a former chair of the Black Panther Party, and they were discussing history. And some things were factually correct that they talked about. This event did happen, but it happened within a particular historical context, which, if not mentioned, distorts the facts. You know, you have a distorted understanding of that, even though it's factually true. You know, sometimes facts can be used to obscure truth. Do you know what I mean? And like, if you can see a Ku Klux Klan person can help a little old African woman across the street, that can be a fact. But that will not be the truth about who the Ku Klux Klan is. Do you understand what I'm saying? So sometimes facts can actually be used to obscure truth. So we want to really get into like these questions and raise questions and have this discussion, because everybody is struggling with the same issues and questions that you're struggling with. So you don't have to hesitate to do that. Also, as you know, our Central Committee is comprised of a number of forces. Some positions our Central Committee have not been filled, and some positions in the Central Committee come as a consequence of people leading work in different regions, or people sometimes having responsibility of different mass organizations of the party. And one person who's not on the Central Committee but leads an incredibly significant organization of the party, I want to also acknowledge her. And that is Comrade Penny Hess, who is the chairwoman of the African People's Solidarity Committee, that has played, an organization that has played, under the leadership of our party, an incredibly significant role in our movement since 1976, was it? 76. And Penny Hess has been a member of that organization since that time, and has made major and fundamental contributions to our struggle, our movement, and I just wanted to mention that. So, comrades, and I'm hoping that people who are also participating in this plenary over the internet, by now this document will have been put forward on Uhuru News, and you can go to it and read with us, and you can also email questions that you may have, and you can intervene in this discussion from wherever you are in the world. So I wanted to acknowledge that, and I think that Comrade Nyabinga is about to make some powerful intervention at this point.
I was just going to say that people can send their emails to dj@uhururadio.com.
dj@uhururadio.com. Comrades, brothers and sisters, I want to just tell you how exciting it is to be here today, and because the presence here is really like a material manifestation of the theory that we represent. We've got Africans here from throughout the United States. We've got Africans here from Belgium and from the United Kingdom. And African couldn't get here from France because of a problem with her passport. And Africans from Germany didn't get here, but a part of this movement. And it's so striking that when we run into each other, we recognize each other, because we got the same brand, as Comrade Rich would say. Rich has branded us, helped to brand us, and comrades, these young comrades throughout the world who are members of our party, members of our movement, you can tell us wherever you run into us, you can recognize us by our swagger. And it's just really important to be able, you know, like to come into this room and to talk with Africans. We say from Paris or from United Kingdom or from Belgium, but sometimes we're talking about from Congo, aren't we? You know, from various other parts of the African world. So it's extraordinarily important to be able to have this experience. And I think that all of us can recognize that. On the 40th anniversary of the founding of our glorious party, raise high the banner of African internationalism and build the Revolutionary Party of the African working class. African People's Socialist Party USA National Plenary, February 18th through the 21st, 2012. At various times during our history, we have declared the significance of building the African People's Socialist Party. At no time has this declaration been more true and urgent than today. Not only is building the party a crucial task of the African People's Socialist Party and our members, it is also the fundamental task of the African Revolution at this critical historical juncture. Our party was first organized 40 years ago in the wake of a crushing military defeat of the African Revolution in Africa and within the US. Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and ultimately Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, founder of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, who was imprisoned following the Sharpeville massacre in March 1960, and after years of imprisonment and other harassment, subsequently died in 1978. However, even as an era of struggle was being brutally brought to a close and the dreams of freedom and happiness of millions of our people were being subordinated to the whims of imperialism, another era was being born with the founding of our party. That era is fully upon us. It is one we have defined as the era of the final offensive against imperialism. Typically, one thinks of a final offensive as the strategic culmination of a military engagement. However, when we speak here of the final offensive, we mean this in historical terms. We mean the achievement of a point where historical conditions have resulted in the emergence of the oppressed peoples as the determinant social force, actively reversing the verdict of imperialism. Europe is staggering from one unity-fracturing economic crisis to another. As a declining dominant imperialist state, the US is seeking a face-saving retreat from bloody military engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, even as it is spreading carnage throughout Africa, and intrigue in South America and other areas in an attempt to forestall its inevitable downfall. After a decade of costly colonial expeditions in Afghanistan and Iraq that were designed to remake the Middle East in the image of the US and establish the US as the permanent global imperial power, an unintended political reconfiguration of the area has resulted in the opposite. Developments in the Middle East have isolated Israel, the US strategic military outpost and white cop on the regional bloc. US satellites that include Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen have been severely undermined by mass uprisings, while its anti-imperialist opponents have grown in strength and influence. Iran is now a burgeoning force in the region despite US attempts at destabilization and so-called regime change. And notwithstanding the immediate success of the US and European imperialists in overthrowing the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya and sowing havoc in Syria. US troops that entered Iraq with great fanfare and bombast were forced to sneak out like thieves in the dead of night. One writer wrote of the US withdrawal thusly, and I quote, "Still, set aside the euphemism and the soaring rhetoric, and if you want a simple gauge of the depth of America's debacle in the oil heartland of the planet, consider just how the final unit of American troops left Iraq. According to Tim Arango and Michael Schmidt of the New York Times, they pulled out at 2:30 a.m. in the dead of night. No helicopters off rooftops, you know that's how they left Vietnam, helicopters off rooftops, but 110 vehicles setting out in the dark from contingency operating base Atta. The day before they left, according to the Times reporters, the unit's interpreters were ordered to call local Iraqi officials and sheikhs with whom the Americans had close relations and make future plans, as if everything would continue in the usual way in the week to come. In other words, the Iraqis were meant to wake up the morning after to find their foreign comrades gone without so much as a goodbye. This is how much the last American unit trusted its closest local allies. After shock and awe, the taking of Baghdad, the mission accomplished moment, the capture, trial, and execution of Saddam Hussein, after Abu Ghraib and the bloodletting of the Civil War, after the surge and the Sunni awakening movement, after the Purple Fingers and the Reconstruction funds gone awry, after all the killing and dying, the U.S. military slipped into the night without a word. If, however, you did happen to be looking for a word or two to capture the whole affair, something less polite than those presently circulating, debacle and defeat might fit the bill. The military of the self-proclaimed single greatest power on planet Earth, whose leaders once considered the occupation of the Middle East the key to future global policy and planned for a multi-generational garrisoning of Iraq, had been sent packing. That should have been considered little short of stunning. Face what happened in Iraq directly, and you know that you're on a new planet, unquote. The so-called new planet is actually a new day, a new era, one that our party has participated in creating for 40 years. It is our day, our era. It is the era of the final offensive against imperialism. However, the full measure of the shifting balance of geopolitical power cannot be fully understood without considering other areas of the world where U.S. imperialism is experiencing a tucked tail retreat. In South America, the advent of the governments of Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, and Daniel Ortega of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua is representative of dwindling U.S. influence on that continent, derisively considered the U.S. so-called backyard in the past. In Asia, U.S. bluster about a nuclear-armed Korea is partially designed to cloak U.S. moves in the Asia-Pacific basin to contain the rise of China as the most obvious challenge to the political, economic, and strategic hegemony of U.S. and European imperialism. Significantly, China's emergence as the fastest, most significant external economic force in Africa is squeezing the U.S. and Europe's capacity to continue hegemonic extraction of economic and political resources, and removes Africa as a guaranteed strategic U.S. geopolitical resource. Our party was born of the brutal repression that destroyed our movement for happiness and the return of our stolen resources. Our mission was defined in part by that repression. We were the living embodiment of the words of Fred Hampton, Black Panther Party leader, murdered by U.S. agents on December 4th, 1969, who said, "You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution." So as revolutionaries were jailed and assassinated throughout the U.S. and the world, the birth of our party actually constituted an organization pointing of the way forward. It was necessary to move beyond the era of protest and organize to win and wield political power. This required the existence of a political party, the highest expression of the will to acquire power. Moreover, the founding of our party was an explicit statement of our recognition that we were not fighting for just any kind of power, but revolutionary power in the hands of a revolutionary class, the African working class. During this presentation, I will say more about the significance of the party's emergence at this critical time. The Black Panther Party was the only revolutionary political party of consequence prior to the emergence of the African People's Socialist Party, and it bore the brunt of much of the counterinsurgent repression, leaving its remnants in a state of retreat. Most other remaining African political groupings preferred to shun designation as a party and avoided the internal dynamics necessary to shape and define the class character of a revolutionary organization. This resulted in ambiguity that most often allowed militant, nationalist, petty bourgeois organizations to hide their class content behind radical-sounding names. However, we were clear that we had to have a revolutionary party rooted in the African working class and committed to African liberation, unification, and socialism. We were also convinced that the tendency of some groups to move toward coalition building as a central component of their work was wrong. We needed a revolutionary party to lead, to lead the revolutionary African working class to power. Political parties exist in class societies and always serve the interests of particular classes. This is also true of so-called coalitions, movements, conventions, and the like. An examination of their programs usually reveal what class is being served by a particular organization. Our objective was to create a party explicit in its class content and its mission to liberate Africa and African people under the leadership of the African working class. The Black liberation movement of the 1960s was crushed before the various contending political and ideological lines within the movement could develop fully and play themselves out on the political battlefield of revolutionary ideas. Our party represented a revolutionary continuum, linking the immediate past of defeat with the present and future. We were never a part of the defeat. We were born as a revolutionary organization that simply moved from one level of struggle to another higher level of struggle. The imperialist U.S. colonial state never succeeded in driving us underground and out of active political life. While one party co-founder was assassinated and I was frequently imprisoned, we were never pushed out of political life. The ideological questions left littering the bloodied battlefields of counter-revolutionary repression did not go unattended. We rescued, resuscitated, and resolved them through the ongoing work of our party. Consequently, the development of our theory and political line was continuous and benefited from our uninterrupted practice in solving the real problems of the revolution. The political and theoretical questions that were roiling our movement and the struggles of peoples of the world at the time of our founding included the questions of the relationship of race to class and the place and role of white people in history and in our struggle. We were also consumed by the need to achieve national identity that challenged the false identity imposed on us by our colonial oppressors. What were legitimate tactics and strategies for liberation, and was violence or armed struggle a viable option? While today there is an academic industry that pretends to speak to these issues, it does so without the benefit of revolutionary social practice. Generally speaking, it is an industry that has separated theory from practice and offers up for public consumption the pristine ideological products emanating from efforts to explain the world without being engaged in or concerned with the practice of changing the world. Another lesson that was consolidated in the founding of the party is the fact that the African liberation movement in Africa and abroad had run into its limitations when fought within the imperialist-defined borders. Civil rights were given and taken back with little afterthought in the U.S., and flag independence in one neo-colonial enclave after the other only served to obscure the imperialist origin of our continued misery. We were experiencing the brutal defeat of our movement on different continents by a united imperialism that had no regards for borders. We understood that the inherent strength of a revolutionary anti-colonial movement based in several continents could only be realized if it were a movement conscious of its connection and its historical mission. We rejected the notion of Africa and African people as permanent charity cases locked in poverty and despair by a fate reserved for black people. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union, presumed by many to be the leader of the international struggle against imperialism, declared that the recipients of its anti-colonial support on the continent were the only legitimate revolutionary forces in all of Africa. They were referred to by the Soviets as the Authentic Six. These were the organizations that received resources and organizational, military, political, and ideological training from the Soviet Union in our struggle to overthrow white colonial rule. A condition for becoming one of the authentic designees was having the so-called correct political line and meeting the needs of Soviet foreign policy objectives. We recognize that Africa should be able to define its own interests without concern for meeting the objectives of some non-African force, whether Soviet socialist or US-supported European capitalist colonialists. Hence, in 1981, at our first Congress held 9 years after our founding, we passed a resolution calling for the creation of the African Socialist International. The ASI put the struggle of our people in our homeland squarely in the hands of Africans ourselves, and more explicitly, in the hands of the most revolutionary sector of the African nation, the African working class aligned with the poor peasantry. With this resolve, the party transformed our individual poverty and powerlessness into our collective wealth and strength. Today, the African Socialist International has some capacity on at least 4 continents. We are in Europe, Canada, and the US, Colombia, and the Bahamas, and West Africa, with growing influence in East and Southern Africa. To coin a phrase of the 1960s popularized by the Zimbabwe African National Union, we are our own liberators. We are the party that brought science to our defeated African liberation movement at a time when it was generally bogged down in racial and cultural nationalism that revolved around candlelit ceremonies and religious obscurantism and nostalgia for an African past that was often imaginary. We discovered the material basis for the exploitation and oppression of Africans and others in the world. We determined long ago that defining our movement as a struggle against racism was a self-defeating waste of time, and that what is called racism is but the ideological foundation of capitalist imperialism. Race is a colonial invention that originated from the enslavement and colonization of Africans and Africa that gave birth to capitalism and simultaneously to the European nation. And rather than defining the system of our oppression, racism is a concept that denies Africans our national identity and dignity and relegates to us the Sisyphean task of winning acceptance from and sometimes becoming one with our oppressors. The political report to the Third Congress of our party quoted a passage from a presentation I made in 1978 in San Francisco that elaborated on our views on racism and explained the ideological departure that helped to distinguish our party in the struggle for revolutionary science. Here's an extract from that presentation. It is a presentation that acknowledged unity in defining our struggle as being against colonialism by a variety of African leaders and intellectuals that included Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, but clearly shows how our party developed and advanced the discussion beyond previous understandings. Quote, what our party did discover that made for a qualitative leap in understanding how to move toward liberation is that in the US, colonialism represents the relationship of class to race. Prior to this discovery, our party was one with most of the pro-independence movement in describing ours as a struggle against racism. At the same time, we were also calling it a struggle against colonialism. That is to say, our movement, still under the ideological influence and of the primitive petty bourgeois civil rightists whose colonial mentality often equated freedom with their proximity to white people, incorrectly used the term racism and colonialism to define the same set of circumstances and oppressive structures responsible for our condition. However, at the moment we were able to understand that what we had been describing as institutional racism was the same thing we meant by the term colonialism, and that these same set of circumstances and oppressive structures imposed on our people were also defined as colonialism historically throughout the world, our ideological and political development increased 1,000-fold. This understanding of colonialism helped to place the responsibility for our oppression squarely on the shoulders of the North American ruling class. Our party was able to discover that our main or primary struggle is against colonialism, which is an imperialist form, therefore necessarily having class connotations, and which utilizes the ideology of racism to justify and obscure the fundamental relationship that African people within the U.S. have with the capitalist colonialist ruling class state. This, unquote, this was a major theoretical advance made by our party. It was one whose further elaboration in the same document clearly helped to move our struggle forward in a manner that undermined imperialism and initiated practices that would contribute to the crisis of imperialism being experienced today. Quote, we discovered that colonialism is the condition we suffer from as a people, and that racism is the ideology that justifies or obscures that racism, that relationship I stated. Colonialism is real and concrete. It is a human-made condition that can be struggled against. On the other hand, we discover that racism is the ideas in the heads of North Americans. Racism is the attitudes displayed by North Americans which makes you whites dupes, allies, and collaborators with your ruling class in its attacks on us, which reinforce and maintains our colonial relationship to the U.S. North American state. Our understanding of colonialism as the relationship of class to race within the U.S. has also revealed for us the inherent reformist character of a struggle by black people against racism. For ultimately, the struggle against racism, when it is given material form, boils down to a struggle for so-called equality with the exploited North American working class, that is to say, equality within colonialism, within capitalism, unquote. I cannot overstate the significance of this contribution to the body of African liberation theory. While all of this is now obvious to members of our party and followers of our movement, during the period of our founding, and for many years later, it was not so clear, and many were trapped in an ideological quagmire. Among the practical benefits of this theoretical development was the response by our party to the issue of the role of white people in history and in the overall struggle against capitalist imperialism. I will not attempt to explore the various positions that attempted to address this issue. Suffice it to say that they range from the religious assumption that white people are the devil to the politically useless pseudo-scientific declaration of whites as genetic mutations. According to both these views, the behaviors of whites was a natural result of these presumed realities. At best, these were attempts to explain the world with the great defect of being unable to change the world. At worst, they were an adoption of the bourgeois concept of race as a permanent dividing line separating humanity into different camps that are ultimately defined by biology, leaving questions of class exploitation and national oppression unaddressed. In each case, there were imperialist serving positions that left the dominant social system and relations of power untouched. The reality of the day clearly shows an imperialism in deep crisis that neither religion nor genetics can resolve. Even the thinking representatives of the imperialists are beginning to say so. Writing in 2007, Zygmunt Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor for U.S. President James Earl Carter, felt it necessary to alert the U.S. ruling class of impending peril for an America that refuses to recognize the shifting balance of power in the world that favors the rise of the oppressed. In his book, Second Chance, Brzezinski tutored the U.S. ruling class, quote, "Global political awakening is historically anti-imperialist." This guy, Brzezinski, was James Earl Carter's National Security Advisor. He is the one that constructed, he's the one who developed the modern jihad. He constructed the process that brought the Soviet Union into Afghanistan with the intent of creating for the Soviet Union a Vietnam that would wipe them out economically and what have you. So I'm not reading something to you from some flake, some weirdo, etc. I mean, might be weird, but he's a respected imperialist weirdo, if he is. So in his book, Second Chance, Brzezinski tutored the U.S. ruling class, quote, can somebody handle that? The ringing, quote, "Global political awakening is historically anti-imperial, politically anti-Western, and emotionally increasingly anti-American. In the process, it is setting in motion a major shift in the global center of gravity. That in turn is altering the global distribution of power, with major implications for America's role in the world. The foremost geopolitical effect of global political awakening is the demise of the imperial age. Empires have existed throughout history, and in recent times, American paramountcy has often been described as a new global empire. Imperial stability has historically depended on skilled domination, superior military organization, and ultimately, most important, political passivity on the part of dominated peoples. The more recent Western European empires grew predominantly through superior transoceanic navigational capabilities motivated by trade and greed for valuable minerals. Modern imperialism is thusly a Western emanation. In any case, the combined impact of global political awakening and modern technology contributes to the acceleration of political history. What once took centuries now takes a decade. What took a decade now happens in a single year. Global systemic instability, moreover, is likely to be prompted in many parts of the world by challenges to existing state frontiers. In Asia and Africa particularly, state borders are often imperial legacies and do not reflect ethnic or linguistic boundaries. These borders are vulnerable to increased pressures as heightened political consciousness leads to more assertive territorial aspirations. The largely anti-Western character of populist activism has less to do with ideological bias and more with historical experience. Western or European domination is part of the living memory of hundreds of millions of Asians and Africans and some Latin Americans, although in this case its sharp edge is pointed at the United States. In the vast majority of states, national identity and national emancipation are associated with the end of foreign imperial domination. This is true in such large and self-confident states as India or China, as it is in Congo or Haiti. Anti-Westernism is thus more than a populist attitude. It is an integral part of the shifting global demographic, economic, and political balance, unquote. Patrick Buchanan, an imperialist ideologue, opponent of Brzezinski and former speechwriter for U.S. President Ronald Wilson Reagan, is even more pessimistic and alarmist in his assessment. Quote, Not one nation of Europe or North America, save Iceland, has a birth rate sufficient to replace its population. All have been below zero population growth for decades. Who will inherit the Western estate? Between now and 2050, Africa's population will double to 2 billion. And Latin America and Asia will add another 1.25 billion people. The greatest European powers fought 2 great wars. All lost their empires. All saw their armies and navies melt away. All are undergoing invasions from formerly subject peoples coming to the mother country to dispossess their grandchildren. All of their welfare states face retrenchment, even as they face tribal decline and death. The conquest of Europe by peoples of color from the old colonies is well advanced. The numbers of those lined up waiting to come and of those lined up behind them stagger the mind. People of European descent are not only in a relative but a real decline. They are aging, dying, disappearing. This is the existential crisis of the West, unquote. Certainly this is an existential crisis of the West. However, long ago we discovered the existential crisis of the West. That crisis is one that both Buchanan and Brzezinski refused to understand. It is a crisis born of the very foundation of the imperialist West. Put another way, it is the pedestal upon which the fortunes of the West have rested since its cankerous emergence on the body of humanity. Capitalism foundation was characterized as so-called primitive accumulation by Karl Marx, who declared its function as playing in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Marx went on to say, quote, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in minds of the aboriginal population, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production, unquote. And again, quote, whilst the cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, it gave in the United States a stimulus to the transformation of the earlier more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World, unquote. Herein lies the basis of the existential crisis. The motion of the oppressed peoples of the world is fast snatching the pedestal out from underneath the so-called Western or white parasite that has feasted off the life and blood of the world for the last few centuries. Europe has existed as a parasite upon the rest of humanity, and what Buchanan and Brzezinski do not want to understand, and what Marx did not anticipate, is we are now facing a world system in an existential crisis because the parasite is losing its host due to the growing resistance of the world's people and an unexpected economic competition from some of those who previously functioned as hosts to this parasite. Even Marx was unable to fully understand the importance of this question. Although Marx declared that this so-called primitive accumulation is the historic equivalent of so-called original sin, and given the fact that he was characterizing earth-shaking events that resulted in the theft, sale, forced labor, and enslavement of hundreds of millions of African human beings, Marx's position on the pedestal of our oppression prevented him from seeing the centrality of this question. What Marx so clinically termed primitive accumulation was in fact the deadly European assault on Africa, North and South America and Australia, and the extension and near decimation of whole peoples. It was the brutal rape of much of Asia and the Middle East, the numerous internecine wars between European states, and the growth in wealth that overturned European feudalism and ushered forth capitalism and the European nation. A real understanding of so-called primitive accumulation would have required Marx to center most of his work on an examination stemming from this reality. But objectively, Marx was himself a beneficiary of so-called primitive accumulation. Like others, his consciousness was shaped by this material relationship to imperialism during his lifetime. The libraries and universities he used for his research were filled with books and philosophy that were informed by this parasitic relationship. Historical necessity did not require Marx to understand and center his work on this reality. However, we are required by history to understand this parasitic historical process that has from the beginning linked Europe, capitalism, and the rest of us in the embrace of death, from which we are now disengaging and about which Buchanan and Brzezinski are crying copious intellectual tears. This is the task that our party willingly undertook, and to the dismay of the Buchanans and Brzezinskis and all the defenders of the imperialist status quo, our success in this area constitutes a fundamental component of the existential crisis of imperialism. Up to now, since the successful rise of imperialism, Europe and white people have been the subjects, and Africans and others have been the objects of what can only be described as imperialist history for the last 500 years. We have been voiceless and reduced to invisibility and statue insignificance. We have already mentioned how Karl Marx characterized the slavery, rape, pillage, and genocide associated with our current status and the emergence of white power as so-called primitive accumulation. In another instance, he referred to slavery as a so-called economic category of the greatest importance. In my political report to the 5th Congress of the party, I commented on what that meant. Quote, "Here the relationship between peoples and countries is also obscured and mystified. Marx attributes European so-called development solely to the genius and productive forces inside Europe. He is thereby covering over or liquidating the origin of such development in the parasitic impairment of the capacity of independent development in Africa and other places victimized by Europe." In another place in the political report, I asked a rhetorical question: would capitalism and the resultant European wealth and African impoverishment have occurred without the European attack on Africa, its division, African slavery and dispersal, colonialism and neo-colonialism, unquote? The answer is obvious to anyone with even a smattering of historical knowledge, but Marx didn't get it. Most of our movement still doesn't get it. Revolutionaries around the world have missed this critical understanding of the foundation of imperialist existence. In fact, the most erudite practitioners of the superstition called capitalist economics don't get it. This is one of the reasons nothing they say about the extant economic crisis of the imperialist world makes any sense. Our summation of this imperialist dilemma is reflected in this quote from our political report to our 5th Congress, quote, "The North Americans, like most Europeans, assume they have some ideas of the basis of the contradictions because of the fantasies passed on to them historically about the source of their comparative wealth and so-called good fortune. Nevertheless, those are resources stolen from others that have become increasingly difficult for them to afford in their malls and supermarkets. It is somebody else's oil wrenched from the earth with bloody consequences for which they now have to pay more. The bauxite, coltan, gold, and diamonds, along with the cocoa beans, cotton, and cheaply produced clothing, have cost the rest of us dearly, and our combined struggles to seize control of our lives and resources are affecting the ability of North Americans and other Europeans to enjoy a parasitic economy that requires global misery for an oasis of white happiness," unquote. The inconsistent materialism of Buchanan and Brzezinski allows them to recognize some relationship between the decline of imperialism and the rise of formerly subject peoples. But, like the imperialist economists, they are blinded by philosophical idealism, the assumptions of white superiority that will not allow them to see the dialectic between Western or so-called white success and African impoverishment. They cannot accept that the changing relations of power are exposing the real dependency, which is the dependency of the colonizer upon the colonized and of whites on Africans. In reality, the essential feature of capitalism is parasitism. In reality, the essential feature of capitalism is parasitism. This is as true of the capitalism of Adam Smith as that of Karl Marx. Wage labor, commodity production, private ownership and control of the means of production are features of capitalism that function on the foundation of parasitism, primitive accumulation, that Marx correctly identified as the equivalent of original sin. This is the starting point of capitalist accumulation and production of the capitalist system itself. This is not to say that everything that Marx said was wrong, but it is to say that everything he said must be reevaluated based on a materialist appreciation of the centrality of capitalist parasitism, of what he called primitive accumulation. Otherwise, we will continue to be duped by those who verbally claim to oppose capitalism, but who cannot oppose parasitic capitalism. We are not Marxists, we are historical materialists. I have taken the historical materialism of Marx, the science of investigating and analyzing society, to investigate and analyze our reality as Africans. Indeed, we are a part of the so-called primitive accumulation mentioned by Marx in his works. Malcolm X, a materialist of sorts in his own right, has been quoted as saying how someone watching another sitting on a hot stove would describe the experience differently from someone actually sitting on the stove. This is true. The spectator is not required to have a full understanding of the experience. The victim of the hot stove is provoked by his reality. It becomes a historical necessity to understand the question. Using the collective experience of African people as a starting place, I was able to use the science of dialectical and historical materialism, cleansing it of its Marxist metaphysics and idealism, to investigate and analyze our relationship to the world. For the rise of capitalism in the world is not based on some purely abstract Marxist theory on the development of human society. It is not a theoretical question. So-called primitive accumulation is not a theory. The rape of Africa, the enslavement of our continent and our people, the forcible dispersal of Africans throughout the world as a means of rescuing Europe from a place of disease and poverty giving rise to capitalism is a matter of record. Marx, the spectator, did not have to understand this. The person sitting on the hot stove, this living, breathing, thinking, so-called primitive accumulation, would either understand this question or perish. I chose to understand. More than that, I chose to develop a worldview stemming from this understanding. This is the origin of African internationalism. African internationalism is simply the worldview stemming from an historical, materialist investigation and analysis of the world, with the starting point being the experience and role of Africans in Africa and the advent of capitalist imperialism as the rise of white power. Parasitic capitalism is the real issue. It is this reality that ultimately distinguishes African internationalist socialism from the struggle for so-called white rights that usually characterizes most movements of Europeans worldwide. It is the difference in real socialism resulting from overturning the pedestal upon which all capitalist activity occurs and some variation of the national socialism achieved by the Nazis of German infamy. Today, the crisis of imperialism has thrust a number of Europeans into motion, from Tea Partiers to Wall Street occupiers in the United States. They have been mobilized by the inability of capitalism to live up to its expectations for Europeans. This is also true in Europe, where thousands of militants are in the streets of Greece. They are demanding that they be restored to their rightful place atop the pedestal of capitalist prosperity. The only problem is that this can only happen at the expense of the well-being of the historical victims of capitalist prosperity, the subject and colonial peoples of the world who are currently fomenting crisis with our struggle for the recapture of our resources, our sovereignty, dignity, and our history. It is an error to assume that this so-called primitive accumulation is simply something that happened a long time ago with no implications for today. The truth is that current capitalist imperialist structures, the ones being challenged in 1,000 different ways today, are structures with their origin in the very genesis of capitalism